I'm Emily. When I was 7, my biological father passed away suddenly from a heart attack on a Saturday morning. I remember it vividly, the smell of pancakes filling the kitchen, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows, and the comforting routine of our weekend breakfast tradition. Dad loved making pancakes, and not just ordinary ones. He would shape them into funny faces, creating goofy expressions that made me laugh until my stomach hurt. That morning, I had just run into the kitchen, eager to help, when everything changed in an instant. One moment, he was standing there, smiling at me, flipping a pancake with a practiced flick of his wrist. The next, he clutched his chest, his face contorting in a way I had never seen before. A sharp, strangled sound escaped him as he collapsed onto the tiled floor. My mother's panicked voice filled the space, her screams blending with the piercing ring of the phone as she dialed for help. The rest of the day was a blur of flashing ambulance lights, the sterile white walls of the hospital, the cold plastic seats in the waiting room, and the sight of my mother sobbing uncontrollably in a way I had never witnessed before. And then, just like that, he was gone. The anchor of our family had vanished, leaving behind a silence that would never fully be filled. In the months that followed, our home felt different, emptier, as if the walls themselves had absorbed the weight of our grief. My mother, once so full of warmth and energy, drifted through the days like a ghost of her former self. She tried to be strong for me, but I could see the strain in her eyes, the way they no longer lit up when she looked at me. The house, once filled with laughter and the comforting presence of my father, became a place of whispers and unspoken sadness. It was during this time that my mother met David, a man she encountered in a support group for widowed parents. He was tall, kind, and had a warmth about him that, in fleeting moments, reminded me of my father. At first, he was just a presence in our lives, a new figure at the dinner table, someone who spoke softly and listened intently. But over time, he became more than that. A year after they met, my mother and David got married, and he moved into the house my father had left us. Adjusting to having a stepfather was a strange experience. I wasn't sure how to feel about him. He wasn't trying to replace my father, and yet, in a way, he inevitably did. He took on the responsibilities my father once held, fixing things around the house, taking us out for ice cream on Sundays, tucking me in at night with a quiet good night. He never forced his presence on me, never tried to push himself into a role I wasn't ready for him to fill. And though I didn't say it out loud, I appreciated that. He was patient, understanding, and always willing to listen when I had something to say. But just as I was beginning to accept this new dynamic, my mother shared some news that changed everything. She was pregnant. I still remember the way her eyes glowed with excitement when she told me. "You're going to be a big sister, Emily," she said, as if it were the best thing in the world. I smiled because I thought that was what she wanted from me, but inside, something tightened in my chest. I wasn't sure why, but I felt an unshakable sense of unease, a whisper of something I couldn't yet name. When Ethan was born, everything in our house shifted. My mother, once a devoted elementary school teacher who had always balanced work and family with ease, quit her job to care for him full-time. "Ethan needs me," she would say whenever anyone asked about her decision. At first, I didn't think much of it. Babies required a lot of attention. I understood that. I waited, assuming that things would return to normal eventually, that my mother would find a way to balance her love for both of us. But as the months passed, it became clear that Ethan wasn't just the new baby in our house. He was the center of it. Everything revolved around him. My mother's world narrowed, her focus consumed entirely by his needs. I started noticing the little ways she forgot about me. She would forget to pack my lunch for school, only realizing it when I mentioned being hungry at dinner. "I'm so sorry, honey," she would say distractedly before returning her attention to Ethan. "I was busy with Ethan's doctor appointments all day." Moments like these became the norm. David, my stepfather, noticed. I often saw him watching my mother with a thoughtful expression as she hovered over Ethan, seemingly unaware of my presence. One evening, as I struggled with a particularly tricky math problem at the kitchen table, David sat beside me and helped me through it. "Emily," he said gently, his voice calm and steady, "sometimes people get so focused on one thing that they forget about the other important things in their life." I knew he was talking about my mother. His words didn't change the situation, but they gave me a sense of quiet comfort. It was the first time I felt like someone truly saw me. As Ethan grew, so did my responsibilities. If the house was messy after a long day of my mother tending to him, I was the one expected to clean it. If his toys were scattered all over the living room, I was the one who had to pick them up. "Emily, help your mother out," was a constant refrain. I loved my little brother, but watching my mother's face light up whenever he babbled a new word or took a wobbly step filled me with a deep, aching loneliness. I couldn't remember the last time she had looked at me that way. As I grew older, I became quieter, more withdrawn. Even when I scored top marks on a test or won an award at school, my mother's response was lukewarm at best. "Good job, Emily," she would say absently before turning back to Ethan. I realized no matter how hard I tried, I could never compete with the place he held in her heart. I wasn't resentful of him. I adored my little brother. But the pain of feeling unseen, of being a shadow in my own home, left a lasting mark. David, more than anyone, seemed to recognize this. He made time for me even when no one else did. He took me to my karate classes twice a week, cheering me on from the stands as if he were my real father. Those moments were a rare source of light in an otherwise lonely world. But even David's kindness couldn't fill the void left by my mother's indifference. He couldn't make up for the fact that, no matter what I did, I would never be Ethan in her eyes. Looking back, those years were marked by a growing sense of isolation. I wanted to be seen, to be valued, to be loved the way my mother loved Ethan. But as time passed, I came to a painful realization. Some things would never change. As the years passed, my role in the family became clearer, not through words, but through the quiet, unspoken expectations that settled over me like an old, familiar weight. I was the responsible one, the dependable one, the one who could be counted on to handle things so that my mother didn't have to. If Ethan needed to be picked up from school and she was too tired, I would do it. If there were dishes in the sink and she was preoccupied with him, I would wash them. If he threw a tantrum and she didn't have the patience to soothe him, I was expected to distract him, to keep him happy, to keep the peace. It wasn't that she was cruel or intentionally neglectful. If anyone asked, she would say she loved me, and in some way I believe she did. But love, I learned, was not always enough. Love could be passive, selective, distant. It could be something given in fragments, in passing acknowledgments, in brief nods of approval rather than the deep, unwavering affection I saw her give to Ethan so effortlessly. I became good at not needing things. It was easier that way. I learned to swallow disappointment before it could fester, to pretend that the empty space where my mother's attention should have been didn't ache as much as it did. I poured myself into school, into books, into the quiet solitude of my own thoughts. If I couldn't have her love in the way I wanted, then I would focus on the things that didn't require it. I excelled in my classes, not because I wanted praise, but because it gave me purpose, something that was wholly mine. While other kids complained about homework, I embraced it. It was predictable, structured, something I could control. Unlike love, unlike family, unlike the shifting dynamics of a house that no longer felt like home, school was steady. It didn't overlook me. It rewarded effort. David remained my one constant. Though he was never overly expressive, he saw me in a way my mother didn't. When I came home with a perfect test score, and my mother merely nodded before returning her attention to Ethan's latest finger painting, it was David who would pull me aside later and say, "I'm proud of you, Emily." Those words mattered more than I let on. He never tried to take my father's place, never asked me to call him Dad. But he was there in ways that counted. When I had my first real heartbreak at 15, it was David who found me curled up in my room, face buried in my arms. He didn't press for details or tell me it was just teenage emotions that would pass. He simply sat beside me in silence, offering his quiet presence as a kind of comfort. And somehow, that was enough. But no matter how much David cared, he couldn't change the way my mother saw me. He couldn't make her look at me the way she looked at Ethan, with that effortless adoration that was as natural as breathing. As I grew older, I stopped trying to earn it. There were no dramatic fights, no screaming matches demanding why I was never enough. Instead, I withdrew. I became a presence in the house rather than a participant. I spent more time in my room, buried in books, in my studies, in anything that kept me from the sting of knowing that no matter how much I accomplished, it would never shift my place in her heart. When it came time for college applications, I didn't tell my mother which schools I had chosen. It didn't seem to matter. David was the one who sat with me as I filled out forms, who helped me weigh my options. When I was accepted into a university out of state, it was David who congratulated me first, who told me that I was going to do incredible things. My mother, when she finally acknowledged it, only said, "That's far," as if my leaving was an inconvenience rather than an achievement. I didn't argue. By then, I had nothing left to prove. Leaving home felt like stepping out of a fog I hadn't realized I'd been living in. For the first time, I wasn't Emily the responsible one, Emily the forgotten, Emily the shadow in the background. I was just Emily. The air felt lighter. I could breathe. I threw myself into my studies, excelling in a way that felt effortless, not because I was trying to be seen, but because I finally had the space to exist on my own terms. I made friends, real friends, people who valued me not for what I could do for them, but simply for who I was. For a while, I didn't go home. When I did, it was out of obligation more than anything. My mother hadn't changed. She still asked about Ethan first, still acted as though my life was a footnote rather than a story of its own. But it didn't sting as much anymore. I had built something beyond her, a life that didn't revolve around her approval. And yet some wounds never fully heal. Even as I thrived, there were moments, quiet, unexpected moments, when I would catch myself wondering what it would have been like if things had been different. If she had loved me the way she loved him, if I had been enough. It was David who in the end gave me the closest thing to an answer. One evening, during a rare visit home, we sat outside on the porch, the air thick with the scent of summer. He looked at me with that steady, thoughtful expression he always had when he was about to say something important. "It was never about you," he said. "It was about her." And maybe that was the truth I had needed all along. Maybe it had never been about my worth, about what I had done or hadn't done. Maybe some people simply aren't capable of loving in the way we need them to. Maybe my mother had given all she could to Ethan because she had nothing left to give to me. And maybe, just maybe, that was her loss more than it was mine. The years that followed my departure from home passed in a blur of movement, cities and studies, friendships that came and went like passing seasons, moments of brilliance and moments of doubt. I built my life carefully, brick by brick, laying down a foundation that was mine alone, independent of the expectations that had once weighed so heavily upon me. I pursued my degree with a hunger that came not from a need to prove myself to my mother, but from a deeper, more personal desire to carve out a space in the world where I could exist wholly and unapologetically as myself. My professors praised my work, colleagues recognized my ambition, and for the first time in my life, I felt truly seen, not as an afterthought, not as an obligation, but as someone of value. Yet no matter how much distance I placed between myself and my past, the shadow of my childhood still lingered in the corners of my mind. It surfaced in small, unexpected ways, the sharp pang of envy when I saw a mother and daughter laughing together at a cafe, the automatic impulse to minimize my own needs and relationships, the way I flinched at even the gentlest reprimands, bracing myself for a dismissal that never came. I had escaped the physical space of my upbringing, but the emotional imprint remained, woven into the fabric of who I was. Some wounds do not announce themselves with grand displays of pain. Some settle in quietly, insidiously, becoming part of the foundation upon which we build our lives. David remained a steady presence, though our conversations became less frequent as my life grew busier. He would call every few weeks, his voice always carrying that quiet warmth that I had come to rely on more than I realized. He asked about my work, my life, my happiness, never out of obligation, but because he genuinely cared. It was in those moments that I felt the weight of what I had left behind most acutely. I missed him. I missed the quiet comfort of knowing that someone in that house had truly seen me, but I did not miss my mother, and I no longer felt guilty for that. Ethan, too, grew older, though he remained frozen in my mind as the golden child, the one she had always cherished more than me. He was in college now, studying something creative, something that my mother spoke about with the kind of pride she had never afforded me. It no longer stung in the way it once had. I had long since stopped expecting anything different. But there was a strange, detached curiosity in me whenever I thought of him. Had he ever noticed? Had he ever questioned the way she had loved him so openly while holding me at arm's length? Or had he simply accepted it as the natural order of things? It wasn't until David fell ill that I returned home for more than just a fleeting visit. The call came in the middle of a workday, my phone buzzing insistently on my desk. Seeing my mother's name on the screen sent a ripple of unease through me. I could count on one hand the number of times she had called me in the past few years. When I answered, her voice was strained, clipped, devoid of the usual indifference. "It's David," she said, and for the first time in my life, there was something in her tone that almost resembled vulnerability. "He's in the hospital." The journey home felt surreal, as if I were moving through a memory rather than reality. The house had not changed much in my absence. It still held the same muted colors, the same faint scent of old books and faintly perfumed air fresheners. But there was something different about it now, something heavier. My mother looked older than I remembered, the years settling into the lines around her mouth, the corners of her eyes. There was no warmth in our reunion, no embrace, no reassurances exchanged. Instead, she simply stepped aside, allowing me entry as if I were a visitor rather than her daughter. David was pale when I saw him, his once strong frame diminished, his voice quieter but still carrying that familiar steadiness. "I knew you'd come," he said, offering me the smallest of smiles, as if there had never been a question of whether or not I would be there. And he was right, despite everything. Despite the distance and the hurt and the years spent untangling myself from this family, I had never once considered not coming. Because David had been there for me in ways no one else had, because he had been the only one who had ever made me feel like I mattered. In the days that followed, I found myself slipping into old roles with an ease that both comforted and unsettled me. I handled the doctors, the paperwork, the difficult conversations my mother seemed incapable of having. I sat by David's bedside, reading to him when he was too tired to speak, offering silent companionship in the way he had once done for me. Ethan visited, of course, but in the way of someone unused to illness, uncomfortable with the weight of it. My mother fluttered in and out, her concern evident but edged with a kind of helplessness, as if she had never quite learned how to care for someone in a way that wasn't performative. And in those quiet moments, I saw her, truly saw her, for the first time. Not as the mother I had spent my life yearning for, not as the woman who had never quite loved me in the way I needed, but as a person A woman who had built walls around herself long before I was born, who had poured every ounce of affection into my brother because perhaps she'd never learned how to love more than one child at a time. A woman who had made choices, some cruel, some selfish, some simply human. And for the first time, I felt something close to understanding. Not forgiveness, not love, but an acknowledgement that she was more than just the sum of what she had failed to give me. David's health declined quickly, and when the end came, it was quiet, almost peaceful. My mother cried, Ethan withdrew, and I did what I had always done. I handled things. I made the arrangements, sorted through the endless paperwork, ensured that everything was taken care of. But this time it was different. This time I did not do it because it was expected of me, because I was the responsible one, the forgotten one who picked up the pieces while others grieved. This time I did it because I loved him, because he had been my family in ways my mother never had. In the days after the funeral, as I prepared to leave once more, my mother and I stood together in the kitchen, a silence stretching between us that felt too heavy, too filled with everything we had never said. She did not ask me to stay. I did not offer to return, but as I reached for my bag, she spoke, softly, hesitantly. "You were always stronger than me," she said, the words barely more than a whisper. And then, before I could respond, before I could unpack the weight of what that admission meant, she turned away. I left without looking back. I had spent my whole life wanting something from her that she would never be able to give. And now, standing on the other side of all that longing, I realized that I no longer needed it. I had built my own life, my own sense of worth, my own understanding of love. And as I stepped into the world beyond that house, beyond the shadows of my past, I carried with me not the absence of her love, but the presence of my own strength. And for the first time, that was enough.